world-renowned art director, Ukrainian origins. He was working in Overwatch, Valorant, Halo Reach. You're a self-taught artist? Explain.
My school was working with other people. It was real-world experience.
And then you come out with Valorant. What was the idea behind this style?
We wanted to be a global shooter. And then you're like, oh, but you can't use all the fancy tools you can usually do at a AAA studio, but it still has to be high quality.
How do you make sure an artist has the voice?
Working at Riot, I felt like I found my voice there.
So you're saying Last of Us should make less environment?
We should really make artists' lives better where they can spend that love and energy and less on just repetitive tasks.
Hi everyone, my name is Ninel Anderson. I'm CEO of Devoted Studios and I'm your host at Devoted Speakeasy. Today we have an amazing guest with us, Artem Volchik. Artem, hi.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. I'm very, very stoked. I'm having a very world-renowned art director, Ukrainian origins. Artem is currently an art director at Riot Games, but before that, he was an art director in Valorant. He was also participating, working at Bungie on Halo Overreach. He was also working in Overwatch and Ghostbusters published by Atari and a bunch of other cool stuff. I wonder when you were like starting working in, Valorant, right? When I guess there's no limits, there's no art guide, there's no art bible, there's no direction. Like, what is the starting point? How do you make something that stands out in a space, which honestly is a pretty crowded space? And then you come out with Valorant and it's just like over the charts everywhere.
That is a fantastic question and a very complex history. So early on, and there was a couple of us. We didn't have any sort of formal art director or anything like that. We're trying to really think through that game space. And in our I guess you call him executive producer or product director, Stephen Lim, who helped found that project. We were looking at what the needs of the player base was there, and a lot of that I felt like from an art perspective and working with a couple other artists that were super talented and helped us explore that space. A lot of that is around getting the people who love that kind of game all around the world able to enjoy it at the same degree. I think that was extremely important to me. And a lot of that requires, thinking about the constraints of hardware and, approach and content and how we think about art. So, this is IP aside, which is a whole different part of how art is involved in creation of a game and a style and stuff like that. But in terms of the art itself and thinking about it from the get-go is really a mixture of understanding the constraints and who we're going to try to build this game for and have appreciate this versus how do we just make the stuff look really good, and really understanding that space I think was a key early component for us.
What was the idea behind the style choice? How did you land on it? Because it's still kind of in the stylized, Riot world, but it's not a hand paint. It has totally different look.
When we think about all the shooters that are available at that time on the screen, what does that look like? And when we think we want to stand out to give people an opportunity to try us out or to see, hey, that looks interesting or that looks like it's different, then we kind of already start to think, well, we're probably not in the hyper-realistic space. And a lot of different art directors use this method where they'll look at basically they'll build out a chart and they'll have the different quadrants of realistic, really stylized, and you can use different words and sort of ways to describe the different areas of those quadrants. But you'll kind of find when you place games in there where the open opportunity areas are. When you think of the ocean of games and what they look like, you can start to see, well, there's a lot of shooters that are very realistic that are also in a modern IP in this corner. And that's very flooded. There's not a lot that are simplified, but also in a modern IP or simplified in a new IP that have new shape language, new dynamics, ways that they feel is very different, the new different tone. And you can kind of chart that out. So we actually did a couple exercises around that and went, okay, there's some opportunity spaces. What do we want our game to feel like? And that's a whole different, conversation of, when you have the opportunity to make something look a certain way, it kind of has to feel like the game too. It has to match the experience because you don't want to create this sort of cognitive dissonance where you're playing something, but what it's showing you is very different. So we want it to be lethal, so we want some sort of seriousness to it. So there's a bit of like this grittiness. There's a bit of like, a little more realistic, like a character is obeying most of the time physics, right? You look at it and you're like, oh, a gun's a gun. It looks like a rocket. Things are kind of obeying that. So we're not going super cartoony. So there's like, a thought process between getting to that point. So the PC Cafe test, again, that's a simple version, but you look at that and you go, okay, that's kind of our step, is like, where can we be different? Another one would be that, when we again talk about hardware constraints, we have to think like, well, what if we can't use a lot of high res geometry or bake down a lot of high res textures? You start to think like, well, what are our options? What are the ways that we can like, make things look a certain way? And then we start exploring different traditional artists or different artists that have inspired us, or different references we find, different techniques we look at. And we've kind of gotten around this mix. And something that really stood out to me is, and this again might not be innovative or anything, but we're trying to leave this idea or an impression of the world and the space through textual qualities, not through the fidelity of those textures. We're just trying to convey that something feels like a hard metal wall, or something feels like it's wood. And we don't need every little grain in there to convey that idea. So really it becomes about reducing detail and creating this impression. And through that, you start looking at like a lot of really great concept artists we worked with, and even the way that they approach just the idea of something, right? When you paint like a little bush in the background, you're not going in there and painting every leaf or every shrub, right? You're kind of leaving the idea that it's there enough for your imagination to fill in the blank.
The passion and also the level of technical detail that you're talking about, and then knowing that you're a self-taught artist.
Oh, you're kidding me.
I've known a lot of people who did like colleges, art schools, and I don't think they talk with such level of a sophistication when it comes to art. Explain.
I always feel very fortunate to have worked with so many talented people that all of those experiences are learning experiences for me. They're all about picking up as much knowledge and understanding and passion from all disciplines: design, engineering, art. And art obviously being my home, like that's where I spend most of my time. So that's like closest to me. Not going to school, but I was very fortunate in working on mods, like I mentioned I think earlier, and a lot of people I worked with were much older, much more experienced. Some were professional developers, and learning like how they thought about certain things and how we made stuff together as a team, I think at an early developer age for me, really like stuck with me. I think that was like kind of the root of, oh, that's what success looks like, is we can be doing this together. And I need to learn a bit more about the technical side, I need to learn a bit more about the design side, and I need to apply my art in kind of a way that helps other, these other areas. I think that was probably where it kind of came from. And that was my school, was working with other people. It was real world experience,
You mentioned that there was a ton of creative and technical challenges that you guys experienced in Valorant, and you probably didn't even think that you're going to overcome that. But can you tell me more, like what were they and how were you able to overcome, and why does life has to be complicated?
We knew we were going to have a min target for hardware. The reason that's important is because we wanted to be a global shooter. So that was like our product direction. One of our pillars, we want to be a global shooter. So that meant really understanding and taking into account the capabilities of the machines, our broad audience was having access to, was able to play on. So a lot of those machines, back in 2013 when we started, we were projecting, okay, if we came out, in X amount of years, they'd still be behind, but probably with this GPU, this hardware set. And we need to make sure it runs at a certain frame rate, because we thought, again, to be global shooter, but also a constraint of being a really smooth shooter, we needed things to feel really good, that it had to have certain frame, we had to hit a certain frame rate. So there's certain technical, constraints on that for content in the engine we were using, which we ended up using Unreal 4, which was a ton of work for engineering to even both make feel good and to run well for us. So they did a ton of work, and just tons of props to them. They've made our lives so much easier over time. When we have that kind of constraint, what that means for us was like I mentioned earlier, that you may not be able to create the high res models and sculpts and normal maps and all that you were used to from working on other AAA projects. So if you went to go work on Call of Duty or, Battlefield specifically, probably at that time, because it just looked way better, like rendering wise than most games out there. I thought, I don't remember when Frostbite became a thing, but probably around that time. And anyway, it looked amazing, right? And we're like, well, we can't do that. Like that's a challenge, right? Riot, especially at that time, with one huge successful game with League of Legends, starting a new team there and also saying you're going to tackle the biggest genre in games at that, probably assuming at that time it was like MOBA with League, and then there's like shooters, right? So you have to kind of make it successful, right? It has to look like, and then you're like, oh, but you can't use all the fancy tools and qualities that you can usually do at a AAA studio, but it still has to be high quality. And that was a challenge, right? So that was a challenge for us to decide then, what does that look like? That's some of the pillars I talked about. We're like, what is our real goal here? Like, what are we trying to get across? And then the other part of that is, and this one I'd say is equally as important, is building a team that you can, in some ways have to convince that that's a good idea. They should come join you because they're super talented. And this would be amazing to have them on board. But they can't do all the things they're used to doing at other studios, right?
That's the best deal you're going to get.
The backgrounds, the environment is stylistically different from, the characters, and it's very simplified. So I was always wondering, is it because of the hardware limitation, or was it to have a broader appeal to the esports audience, or maybe there was some other, ideas behind that? But it seems like it was hardware limitations, whatever we can do with the cards that we've been given, right?
So it's both. I think you touch on another good point where it was obviously a mixture, big complicated problem. Artistically, the other thing we had to solve in the game itself, so tech aside, was that readability in games. Now, these days, I've looked at a lot of different shooters, a lot of different art direction, different places, and I think this is more commonplace now. And I'm not sure if this is during the time we were making Valorant or after that this became more known, but readability is a pillar you have to really focus on as an art director and as an art team. It's not a given, not purely just because art just works in a way that you have to understand how the layers come together. It's the composition of all those elements that really make something really great, but also that in a game when things are very, dynamic and things move and pace and things are just changing all the time, that all these elements always have to work together. And in a shooter specifically, especially a competitive shooter, and we weren't necessarily aiming to be we have to be a big esports, or everything has to be really clear. It has to feel really fair and good, and it has to be something that people feel like they weren't sort of gypped on because it was just hard to read. It's that was something we had control over as artists, and something I was passionate about was I couldn't really read characters in other games. And I played a ton of shooters. I mean, I love shooters, and sometimes it was just so annoying, even back to Counter-Strike days where you're like, was that person was it hard to read them because their value of their helmet or their body armor against that wall was just, or was it me? Or was I just not good enough to see that, right? And I always thought that was a little unfair, is that the art wasn't doing service to the gameplay. And so that was a really big priority for me, is readability. And there's different ways to get that. And I think what you had highlighted is the environment is sort of the backdrop. It's the kind of game board for the action to happen. And so there's a certain way we need to blend that in so that it's not all, hard edges and corners and, the bottom of how a building comes to a ground layer. You need blending there. You need ways to kind of make it not feel so in your face, so pops out. And the characters, both in height and, shape and shaders, all need to do something to kind of help pop out and be readable. And then there's the whole team aspect of, friend versus foe, and that's a whole big thing. But a lot of that is game design and art working together to solve those challenges beyond the tech. Yeah.
I feel like one of the major things that pops in the game is the abilities, the effects of the characters. It looks in the game so much more vibrant and also looks differently stylistically than other aspects of the game. So when we see them being deployed. So what was the idea behind that? How did you come up with it?
The team as a whole, I think when we worked on different versions of prototyping and then visual target spaces, these are areas we explored and kind of we had a lot of feedback sessions and different ways of, identifying like, where do we need to pull and push certain elements. And some of the learnings we had from, the benefit we had of working at Riot was League of Legends and all their, history of learning about game clarity and readability, was that we knew that there was a really clear hierarchy we can have with VFX as an element versus characters as an element, in the way that we could sort of stylize those elements, push color in those elements, push shapes in those elements, make them more visceral or pop more from, certain keyframes of how those shapes will present on screen. Like there's learnings already we could pull from and go, hey, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There's a really great diagram and breakdown of how League of Legends learned to do this. Let's talk to them and see what challenges they faced. Let's, inherit some of the like learnings from that. So one, that was like a team effort. I think there's a lot of, great people who contributed to that. Things that have also evolved because I left a bit before the game had launched. So, and I spent like 5.5 years at Riot on Valorant. So a lot of portion from the beginning to, I'd say like the pre-production phase where we did our visual target and all that. But there's a lot of great people that also came after me to help make sure that the game was not only realized, but, a lot of these things were finessed and things really did great for the player. And I'm super happy with, and I'm very proud of a lot of the guys and girls there who did great work to make that realized. So I need to call that out too. I think it's important. A lot of people did a lot of great things to make that a reality.
I don't want to dive deep into core art values and pillars. Both working on joining as an artist, right? Where you had to follow the ones that were already created by others. What do you feel like the difference working as an artist and building it as an art director?
Learning a bunch from these other teams and franchises that I worked on that existed, or we were building through a lot of great minds that already spent a lot of years on it. The things that come to mind are like picking up like what's unique about this, like what helps us understand like the voice of the visuals for this. Is there a language? So for Halo, for instance, something that I think was pretty amazing that they did early was created a visual language for both the Covenant and the UNSC. So like, you basically only see the shell-like shapes, the color palette, the always, inserts versus extrusions in the Covenant type of design. So you kind of started to build a language around like how you would construct, how that stuff, from the world perspective was constructed as an artist. You're like, oh, that helps me understand how to make this stuff read, how to like think about expanding upon the design. And then for the military, human UNSC, it's like certain angles and like, the weaponry has a certain feel, very much more, militaristic and, angular, boxy. And you start to build that language and you see it in the armor and, you see all these characters in the world start to like really take shape. I think that was important to have some kind of guidance on that, some kind of understanding, like how does this world come together? As an art director, as a leader on any team, I think before you have that stuff figured out, I think it's important to put some stakes in the ground on like what's important as boundary points. And I personally like to think about it as like, here's what we value as like the boundaries of our work. And then you kind of let the team help you narrow in on what is the best version of that. Because, my belief, personally is that no one person's going to have the answer. And especially in a subjective creative field, especially on a new project, new IP, new team, you name it, they threw it at us. You have to be able to utilize the amazing talent you have on your team. And if you start with, here's what I value, you get none of the other perspective on what could be important or what could be valuable to other people.
Follow me, come on.
How do you make sure an artist has the voice? How can you project your voice but still be within the pillars? How can you add but not take away from the main focus? Like, what is the balanced dance there?
So I think having a voice as an artist, you've got to build a team around that being a priority. So in prototype, I think that's probably the most ideal place to do it, because when you're in production, there's a lot of things moving, there's a lot of expectations. It's, I think, much more difficult to come into a team when they're in full-blown production and go, well, I have this different idea, because there's so many things that are important for the overall product that it's different. It's difficult to move that needle, I think, at that point. But if we just talk about the early stages, at least what I felt was important to do was bring people in, one, give them as much transparency and context on what is this game, what is the art focus on this game, what are the downsides to being an artist on this team, right? What are things you won't be able to do because, you know, it's just not something we're doing on this game. It's not important to our player base, or it's not something we're willing to sacrifice for our player base. And really give all that transparency, find people who are aligned and excited about that, who still bring their own, you know, unique backgrounds, perspectives, and work. And then I think from the get-go, if everything works out and, like, you know, the team has interviewed them and they've interviewed the team and they all feel good, then you start with, we trust this person, we hired this person. When they bring up ideas, they bring up problems, we take them seriously. And one of the things we did that I hope everyone enjoyed, I think we had a great time doing it, were our team art syncs. And it was a space where we could share work. You didn't have to. We could talk about it. It's a place where, especially as the team grew and they had different pods and different areas they would work on, we could come together and go, hey, we're still one team. We still can bring up, hey, I have this issue on the character team. Do you guys see that in environments? Hey, on the environment team, you know, you guys did this and it was really awesome. How'd you guys go about that? It's a place that we could actually, like, talk about that as artists and kind of just be in our own little zone.
Right. And you have both experiences, right? Working in the companies that already had established culture like Riot and Blizzard, but now working at Raid Base, you get to build your own culture on the team, right? When you have all this freedom, like you don't have corporate governance, you need to participate, make all the choices. How do you make choices between, you know, art and product, for example?
So luckily for me, there's another artist. So when I started, there was already an art director, Drew Wolf, who's an amazing artist, amazing human being that I work with. And I think, you know, as a team, because we at least, you know, we talk a lot as like co-developing and all of us at Raid Base. But if we just talk about art, you know, I think we really just care about making sure we can do it as a team and that we can hopefully stay small enough where we can all contribute and build this together. And one of the things we do is really slowly hire. And that can seem painful for a startup where you're like, we have so much to do, so much and little time because we have, you know, we're not at these big companies. So the drawback, you know, is that we don't have infinite funding. So we kind of think like, oh, there's a clock running, right? But one of the things that I think is beneficial in the slow hiring is you can really share, get to know people, understand, like, are they excited? Do they get excited about what we're doing? Do they need to know more about what we're trying to do? How much can we learn about this person? And hiring is obviously very difficult. And I think a lot of times we feel like in the industry that we only get to spend like an hour or two with somebody. And then we're like just kind of signing them up for like years of their life, right? And that's a little unfair, right, for both sides. So we try to spend a lot of time. And I think, you know, and again, Drew and I have talked a lot about how, you know, we want to do this as a team. And so the fortunate part that I was going to say for me is, you know, I've always had other people, we could all work together on these kind of problems. It's never like you're alone. And maybe that's a message for the audience is, you know, you're not alone in a lot of this stuff. And a lot of us should be operating as a team. And if something is, you know, hey, I feel this like sense that maybe we're not working together on these things, you should be talking about those things. That's something we like to do is just go, hey, we're going to bring this up. And we're going to talk about it, you know, and maybe that means we spend an extra couple hours this week kind of trying to figure out what that problem is. But what it does for us is it'll build rapport with each other. It'll build trust with each other. It'll help us understand, you know, where we get stressed out or where we can, you know, better solve things together. And so I think that's part of building that culture too for us is spending that time understanding like, hey, what problems are we trying to solve? Get everyone's input, try to do that together. So I'd say that's a big part of the like responsibility as an early team is caring about that part.
But art versus product, what's the balance?
They should be hand in hand.
Hand in hand, hand in trotter.
So art should service the product. And I am passionate about this space where games, you know, they're not just art on its own. And I think maybe sometimes it's hard to help people learn how to best navigate this space where they can really learn about how to make their art really effective for the product. The reason I say it that way, and that maybe the artist part of me that's passionate about the space, is that there's so much joy that can come from making our art valuable to our end users, right? The gamers out there who are going to play this, investigate it, try to come up with theories of why someone's placed a certain way. Why is this cup bent over this way? Is it like a relic from someone else at a different time? Like they're going to just like fantasize about this whole world. And we're going to be the ones building a lot of that. And I think understanding where your art goes, how people are receiving it is extremely important. And I think that's where the art first product comes into play. And what I mean by that is when we have art that we have to make, we need to understand the context in which it's used. And we can then better make decisions over how do we prioritize the amount of effort that goes into that art. There's an example, one of the guys that I work with uses a lot is like, play through a single player game, like Last of Us or something else, right? And he just runs by like hundreds of hours of effort of environments, doesn't look at it more than like a second, And that's like, that's a real, a reality is that like artists pour all their love and energy into these spaces. And sometimes without the right context, it doesn't really help make the product better, where their time could have been used on, well, you could make a couple kits that we could use there to build that same space, but you could really focus on like that next event that the player's going to spend a lot of time in. I think that's where art and product kind of sometimes aren't working well together, is because the products just make a bunch of this content. And the artist's like, okay, I'll make that content, but I don't really know where it's used, but that's just what my job is. And then they don't feel agency over how they can really get that art to be really great for people who are going to play the game.
So you're saying Last of Us should make less environment art?
That's great. They're going to listen to this and be like, who's this guy? Yeah, I just mean that, we should really just spend the time making artists' lives better where they can spend that love and energy, and less on just repetitive tasks that they're like, oh, I just need you to make 50 more trees. It's like, well, why?
As somebody who works in external development and receives feedback on things that users will never see, it has to be pixel perfect at this little bottom of this little shoe thing. And you're like, we can put this time and effort into something that, humanity is going to appreciate. But, it's a never ending debate. Obviously, you have a ton of experience working with within some major AAA companies. And I'm sure each of them is a different experience and different learning, right? What did you learn? What are the coolest stuff or the most interesting takeaways from working there?
When I worked at Bungie, we made Reach in like a year and a half or less. And that it felt like a SWAT team. It was like, we went in, we like how to produce a game at high quality super efficiently and like with people who were just like on top of everything. And that was like an amazing, I was like, wow, like we made this whole AAA crazy game. And we didn't, some groups did crunch a bit for sure, but it was amazing. And that team, we were close. We gave each other amazing critiques. Like we helped each other grow. I worked with a character artist there. We'd always little show and tells. We'd like look at each other stuff like, oh, I'm going to make stuff a little bit better than what he did last time. And it was just such a great environment to, learn how to be really effective. When I worked at Blizzard, that place, I love Blizzard games, and getting a chance to work with so many of those talented people, it was great in so many different ways. But something I came away with from that studio with was really focus on quality, commit one of their pillars was commit to quality as a studio. And that to me, I took that away, not just because of the words or the level of quality we created, but how we talked about things, how we worked together over things, how we redid things, how we understand, okay, well, this could be a bit better here. And, this fits this other concept better. And let's try to make this material and rendering a little bit, we could really finesse. And you could say it was a little obsessive over trying to get to a quality bar, but that was like, wow, I'd never worked with people like that before. And there's so many amazing, talented people who really committed to that. So that was amazing. Riot, beyond as a gamer and as a developer, and this is all personal, obviously, is I felt like I found my voice there, like what I cared about, why I was making games. The founders, a couple of the close people I worked with, they were all just so committed to the player base and so patient in trying to figure out through the problems, like, hey, how do we do this? How do we understand this better? How do we hire, people who can really help us with this? And that never strayed. And I always felt like when I started gaining a voice there, having some form of impact, I took that very seriously. And I was like, wow, this is passion for me.
But besides your commercial, I guess, full-time employment, I know that you very much cherish side projects. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Is it more, projects with friends? Is it more your personal projects? Is it more like, commercial gigs?
For me, side projects have always been, well, mostly, I won't say always, mostly like a personal growth aspect for me. When I was early in my career and I was learning game engines, I had that, that sense and that inkling to like, well, how do I render higher quality? How do I do more cinematic level things? Because I don't get to do that work. Let me go investigate this, like these 3D renderers in Max, like Brazil and, V-Ray and all these like just higher end things. And that started to teach me that there's other ways we can look at creating art inside of games. And maybe the future will be a little bit more blended between this. So fortunately, I was able to pick up a lot we did end up using. But that was like, again, I think, as a successful case, I was like, okay, well, that was really awesome. So when I'm working on something else and have that inkling of like, well, I need to do something a little bit more different at home, challenge myself. I get this creative energy. I kind of want to like build something. So I use that a lot as a growth point for me. And it's something I can always kind of go and, challenge myself. So that's a lot of what side projects do for me.
I love that. Artem, thank you so much for finding time, for being my guest, for sharing your stories and your challenges and how you've grown into being a successful Ukrainian origin art director. I'm very, very proud from being a self-taught artist. It's just an amazing story. And I'm really, really grateful that you're coming and sharing it with me. Thank you so much. And can wait to do a fireside chat whenever you guys announce your new game.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for letting me share my background.